So good evening, everyone. This is a wonderful turnout. Pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming out. My name is Colleen Cameron, and I'm one of the members of the Antigonish Poverty Reduction Coalition, who's putting this talk on this evening. And I should also mention that we also have the Coady Institute supporting us by giving us this room for free. And Gasha, who's been supplying us with the tea and coffee and snacks out there, and the Community Sector Council of Nova Scotia, who's also been very much a part of organizing this tonight. So, as you know, tomorrow is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, and we are so pleased to be able to have Senator Art Eggleton to come and join us here tonight. We're going to talk about the universal unconditional income for Canadians as a way of looking at eliminating and reducing poverty. So I won't go on any further. I'll introduce you to Senator Eggleton. And as you know, he has a long history. He has served the people of Canada and the city of Toronto in public office for over 40 years. He was born, raised, and educated in Toronto, where he worked as an accountant before being elected to City Council in 1969. He served 22 years as a member of the Toronto City Council and the Metropolitan Toronto Council, most of these years on the executive committee of both councils. Between 1973 and 1980, he served as the city budget chief, the member of the council responsible for financial matters. From 1980 to 91, for 11 of those 22 years, he was mayor of Toronto, the longest serving mayor in the city's history. In addition, he has served on the Metropolitan Toronto Police Commission, the board of the Canadian National Exhibition, and numerous committees and task forces dealing with community issues. In recognition of his service to the city, Mr. Eggleton received Toronto's highest honor, the Civic Award of Merit, in 1992. Art Eggleton served 11 years in the House of Commons as member for York Centre in the city of Toronto. First elected in 1993, he was soon thereafter appointed to Cabinet, where he served in the following positions: President of the Treasury Board and Minister responsible for Infrastructure, Minister for International Trade, Minister of National Defence, Vice Chairman of Cabinet Committee on Economic Policy. In his final 2 years in the House, from 2002 to 2004, he served as the Chair of the Greater Toronto Local Area Liberal Caucus, member of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade, Chair of the Canada and Israel Interparliamentary Group. On March 24, 2005, Art Eggleton was appointed to the Senate of Canada. He currently serves as Deputy Chair of the Standing Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology, and is a member of the Standing Committee on Transport and Communication and the Human Rights Committee. He is also co-chair of the All-Party Anti-Poverty Caucus. And in 2011, he was elected to the Bureau Management Committee of the Liberal International, an organization of liberal and progressive democratic political parties. He is chair of the Global City Indicators Facility, operating from the University of Toronto, and is a volunteer honorary member or member of several nonprofit boards and advisory committees. So as you can see, he's very, very well qualified to be here and speak with us tonight. He's going to introduce and be the keynote, and afterwards we're going to be followed by some panel members who I will introduce at that time. Thank you very much, Senator. Thank you. It's already on. This is the button. Right.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Colleen. I'm delighted to be here. She noted that I was the longest serving mayor of Toronto. My only hope is that somebody named Ford doesn't surpass me. Anyway, we have an election coming up a week from Monday, and we got a chance for a new mayor. Anyway, I'm delighted to be with you, and particularly on this eve of the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. Eradication sounds like a very aspirational word, but I think in the Canadian context, I think it's really quite achievable. And as you can see, what I'm going to talk about tonight is we can't afford poverty anymore. And that's a conclusion that we came to after a 2-year study that was done at the Social Affairs Committee by us on the subject of poverty, housing, and homelessness in Canada. And this is a copy of the front of the report, which was led by myself and Senator Hugh Siegel. Now, poverty in Canada. The report indicated that a staggering 10% of our fellow citizens lives in poverty. And that in a numerical sense, just to get an understanding of it, is equivalent to every man, woman, and child in the Atlantic provinces combined. That's 3.5 million Canadians. It's a lot of Canadians. Now I know 10% would be a low number for parts of this province, including this community. But that's the figure overall. There are different ways you measure it, and it sometimes goes up and down. But overall, we have for a great number of years now experienced a staggering 10% of our population. This for our fellow citizens in poverty. Every day is a battle with insufficient income, unaffordable housing, inadequate clothing, and unsatisfactory nutrition. And as you can see, a recent report from UNICEF ranked Canada way down, 24th position out of 35 industrialized nations in the area of child poverty, which it says is about 13%. This in spite of the fact that the House of Commons 25 years ago unanimously said it was going to eradicate child poverty by the year 2000. We still have double-digit child poverty in this country. And Food Banks Canada, in its recent report, said 900,000 Canadians, and 38% of them are children, need help from food banks every month. And since the recession, you've heard that by some people saying that the recession, we've recovered from it. Well, food bank usage is up 31% since the recession. And 1 in 7 school children in this country, they go to school every day hungry. And if you look at some quarters of the population, for example, Aboriginal groups, it's much higher than that. And of course, the dreadful conditions that many of our Aboriginal people live in is something that we also have as a very clear indication of the degree of poverty in this country. On the housing side, 4 million people are struggling to find decent, affordable housing, many of them spending much more than the 30% guideline that the Government of Canada through CMHC has put out. And at least 200,000 Canadians experience homelessness in a year. 30,000 of them are homeless on any given night. And according to the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness in a recent report, they say that there are another 50,000 people that are near homelessness, people that are surfing on couches, living in garages or wherever they can. So they're considered to be the near homeless. And the one thing that we've continually found out in our study and in other studies that have been done in this country is that it is more expensive to have someone live on the street than to give them shelter with support services. Because in the system of shelters and the system of going into the hospital emergency rooms or going to jail, whatever a lot of homeless people do, the chronic homeless people are involved in all of those institutions. It's far more expensive than to give them proper housing and support, far more expensive to leave them on the street. We've also found in our studies that our society is becoming more unequal. Income inequality, wealth inequality, threats to our social fabric and democracy from this inequality, inequality of opportunity. This, of course, gained a great deal of prominence through the Occupy movement, when they started to compare the 1% to the 99%, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, but also the growing gap between the rich and the rest, many people in the middle class. A lot of this income inequality has come about as a result of some dramatic changes in the labor market. Globalization, new technology, a lot more outsourcing by companies as a result of globalization, a lot of industries cutting costs even while their executives are getting more money. A lot of people are being cut out of their jobs. There's a loss of considerable number of manufacturing jobs. Union membership, unions were a part of building the middle class of this country in the post-war era, and yet that membership is going down. And of course, attempts to shrink government by cutting a lot of needed programs. All of these things are part of the changes that are making for a more unequal society. Let me go in briefly into each one of these. First of all, what some people are saying about it. Income inequality is the defining issue of our time, according to Barack Obama, the President of the United States. Growing inequality is the flip side of something else, shrinking opportunity. This from Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, who talks about not only the threat to our social fabric, but the threat to the vigor of our economy. Here's an economist I admire a great deal. He has done a great deal of work on the question of income inequality. Inequality, even The Economist magazine says inequality has reached a stage where it can be inefficient and bad for growth, and numerous other organizations in this country and around the world are talking about the challenges of inequality and the crisis of inequality. The Conference Board of Canada, the OECD, the World Economic Forum out of Davos says that it is the greatest single economic threat. The recent book by Thomas Piketty out of France about capital in the 21st century. The new mayor of New York, Mayor de Blasio, saying it's the core crisis of our time, and he's helping to organize other mayors in the United States. So around this issue. So the bottom line is that this is a major issue, according to many experts, many organizations. Now, in Canada, Statistics Canada reports that from 1980 to 2005, the income of the richest 20% of Canadians grew by over 16%, and the poorest 20%, the poorest quintile, went down by some 21%. And for those in the middle, earnings were essentially stagnant. Now, people will talk about, but more recently there are different numbers. But you know, there may be peaks and valleys, but over a 30-year period of time, over a substantial period of time as this is, 25-year period of time, it has been stagnant for those in the middle. And meanwhile, in 2012, the top 100 CEOs made 169 times the average Canadian salary. In 1980, it was 40 times. The current average compensation for the top 100 is $7.7 million. The average Canadian salary is $45,000. I find that obscene. It is something that is far too extreme. Wealth inequality. Well, you can see here the top 10%, 47.9%. If you take the first two deciles, it's 20% of the population controls 68% of the wealth. Another interesting piece of information is that the wealthiest 86 residents in this country have the same amount of wealth as the poorest 11.4 million Canadians combined. 86 people. And with wealth comes a great deal of power. In fact, Louis Brandeis, who was once a member of the U.S. Supreme Court of Justice, said, "We can either have democracy in this country or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." Now, business columnist David Olive in the Toronto Star writes about this. After inflation, the middle class hasn't seen a pay raise in 3 decades. corporate profits have skyrocketed. CEO pay, as he points out, and that as well. Income stagnation amid spiraling prices for fuel, tuition, decent shelters force many Canadians to borrow beyond their means to make ends meet. And this is something that the former governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, indicated his great concern of. The heavy household debt that has been accumulating in this country. And the Certified General Accountants Association recently said that 1/3 of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck. So heavy debt, living paycheck to paycheck, many of them having insufficient provision for pensions. This creates a great deal of stress and worry as people find it more and more difficult to make ends meet. Now, here's a point of view of a person of the conservative persuasion, but he's quite clear in saying that a society in which a small group is perceived to be benefiting unfairly, there are wide gaps between social and economic classes, can lead to dissension, jealousy, antisocial behavior. It talks about increases in crime, loss of participation in social and charitable organizations, and greater demands for government intervention to deal with social tensions. Now that comes from a person who was a policy advisor to Prime Minister Harper, and it very much echoes, it brings in the fact of fairness into all of this, and it very much echoes the kind of remarks that came from a couple of British epidemiologists, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, in their book, The Spirit Level. We've also seen in our cities how inequality plays itself out. In Toronto, for example, Professor Holchansky at the University of Toronto did a study, talks about Toronto as 3 cities now, one for the very wealthy, one for those who are very poor, and a shrinking middle class. And he talks about the middle class having been about 66% of our neighborhoods in 1970, and today it's 29%. So much more of them are of low-income neighborhoods and a few of very well-off neighborhoods. So that polarization is an issue as well. In the city of Hamilton, they say there are 2 communities 5 kilometers apart, and yet there is a 21-year difference in the life expectancy between the poorer neighborhood and the richer neighborhood, just 5 kilometers down the road. So these are threats to our social fabric, threats to our democracy. Inequality of opportunity. Well, you hear that there was an increase in the number of jobs last month, but if you go over the long haul, you find out that isn't such a bright sign. The OECD ranked Canada 20 out of 24 when it came to job creation. We're down towards the end of the list. And in fact, if you look at employment as opposed to unemployment, you get a bit of a different picture. Because when you talk about unemployment numbers, it really doesn't give you the whole picture, because there's a lot of people who have dropped out of the market for looking for a job, who can't find a job, so they are no longer part of the statistics. So you can look at the other side of the coin, the employment side of the coin. Back before the recession, 63.5% of those eligible for employment were employed. Now it's 61.6%. So it's actually dropped. We actually have less people employed than we did prior to the recession. And of those who do get jobs, a lot of them are precariously employed, part-time, casual, temporary contract work, work without benefits, without a lot of security. So that has been a growing area of employment in the last number of years. And this comes out of a study from McMaster University and the United Way of Toronto. And then there's the Temporary Foreign Workers Program. Originally meant for seasonal workers or for live-in caregivers, and for some skilled shortages, but it has really grown way out of control, going from 140,000 to 340,000 in the last few years. Thank goodness the government is talking about putting some brakes on this particular program to get back to something that is really what it was intended to do in the first place. And youth, age 20 to 24, one study shows they're 41% worse off financially than their counterparts were in 1976. The unemployment rate for youth is double that the general unemployment rate. It's at about 14% for Aboriginals, and for people of racial minorities, it can be a lot higher than that. And even those who are employed, a lot of them are underemployed. A lot of them are having a very difficult job, a very difficult time getting the kind of jobs that they're trained for, that they're educated. You know, we're a well-educated country, but there are a lot of people that can't get the kind of jobs that they want, and it's taking them longer to be able to get to something where they can then raise a family. So this has led to the suggestion that this generation, a generation at risk, may not do as well as their parents. So inequality of opportunity. Now, the moral argument against poverty and inequality is this suffering and want in a land of plenty, a country that is rich. The unacceptable toll in terms of lives diminished, dreams deferred, and potential denied. Those are the moral arguments. But what I think most people don't realize is that what the economic cost of poverty is, how it's costing each and every one of us, drives up our tax bills, depresses our economy, increases our health care bills, it breeds alienation and crime. And I firmly believe that the future level of our prosperity depends on our addressing the current level of our poverty. The cost of poverty. This came out of another study that was done a few years ago. It was contributed to and edited by some noted economists, Don Drummond and Judith Maxwell. It involves some policy analysts such as James Milway and John Stapleton in coming to these conclusions. So here's a chart that shows you both the private costs and the social cost, the cost of society overall of poverty. And this doesn't include welfare payments. You'll notice 7.6 billion in terms of health care costs. These are annual costs. The lowest income quarter of Canadians uses twice the health services as the wealthiest quarter of Canadians. So for those who are in low-income positions, health care is a very major issue. And in fact, 1 in 4 who are below 30,000 income have stopped or delayed taking needed prescription drugs. They just can't afford to do that. Now, there are some people that are on programs, prescription drug programs, either in the private sector or the government programs for seniors or some people in the population, those on the social assistance system. But for a lot of people, a lot of the working poor, for example, who can't afford it, they stop. 1 in 4 stop taking their prescription drugs. And health experts also tell us that adequate housing is a key determinant of health. In fact, the Canadian Medical Association, in a report last year, said, in talking about fixing healthcare, they say that fixing healthcare is more than just fixing the healthcare system. Because they say the healthcare system is about 25% of the cost of healthcare. Genetics is another 25%. But 50%, they say, are the social factors, the social determinants of health, such as housing, such as education, such as income. Senator David Kroll, in talking 40 years ago on another poverty study that was done in the Senate, talking about our social assistance system, said, "We are pouring billions of dollars every year into a social welfare system that merely treats the symptoms of poverty, but leaves the disease itself untouched." So there we have it. Cost of poverty between the societal cost between 24 and $30 billion. Oops. Okay. Now, on the other side of the coin is the poverty income gap. According to the National Council on Welfare in 2011, I saw this in one of your pamphlets as well, the dollars and cents of poverty was what the report was called, states that $12.3 billion a year would bring everyone just over the poverty line. So you have about 30 billion in the cost of poverty. You have 12 billion as the poverty income gap. How much better? How much better it would be to have the 12 billion rather than the 30 billion. 12 billion brings people up over the poverty line. 30 billion certainly hasn't been doing that. Well, some solutions to all of this. First of all, I believe we need tax reform. We haven't had a review or an overhaul of our tax system since the Carter Commission of the 1970s. At that time, the Income Tax Act that was produced out of those, the implementation of those recommendations was about 400 pages. Today, it's over 3,000 pages. It's loaded with loopholes. It needs overhaul. It needs to be made more progressive and fair for the population. There's no reason why we can't also be putting in more tax brackets than what we have. Our highest marginal bracket at the moment is 29%, and that this is the federal rate, not the provincial rate, but the federal rate. It kicks in at 135,000. But in the United States, they have two brackets that are even higher than that, 35% and 39% for people over 400,000. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives said if we have a bracket at 32% and one at 35%, we'd be getting about 12 billion a year. Now that would help pay for the cost of bringing everybody up over the poverty line. In fact, if the government of the day hadn't canceled the 2% out of the GST, that also would have helped to bring people up over the poverty line, because that was worth about $12 billion. But I think we also need to look at other parts of the tax system, such as tax havens and tax evasion. We need to look at the question of a price on carbon emissions. We don't have an inheritance tax, although most of the countries in the G7 do. Inheritance tax just on large estates over $5 million. Or perhaps a financial transaction tax, which some 40 countries already have. So there's a lot of work I think we can do in this area to help make the system work better. I'm not afraid to talk about taxes. A lot of people in public life, a lot of politicians would be afraid to talk about taxes. They think it's a four-letter word or something. But I think taxes are the price we pay for civilization. They're the goods and services that help to make our society better. And I think we should be taking that more positive attitude about taxes. Secondly, we need to invest in post-secondary education for underrepresented groups. We may be amongst the best educated in the world, but there are some groups in our population, Aboriginals, low-income people, who are underrepresented, and we need to focus more on their education. Infrastructure investment. That's a good way of getting more money into the hands of people, getting more jobs. Affordable housing can be part of that. We need a national housing strategy, and we need early learning and childcare. These are kind of investments that we could make. We make our tax system work better. These are the kind of investments that we'd be able to make. Early learning and childcare. The medical officer of health for Canada has said that $1 invested at this point in time in early learning and childcare saves between $3 and $9 later on in social costs that we can avoid if we make that kind of an investment. There's the minimum wage. This is instead of a redistribution of the taxes, this is a pre-distribution. This is something that the government doesn't have to pay, but the government does put it into legislation. There are differing rates within the country. They're largely provincial rates. The federal government currently doesn't have a minimum rate. It could, because there are a number of industries such as the airline industry, the broadcast industry, the banking industry that are governed by federal legislation. It could have a minimum wage. It was one of the recommendations in our report. And whatever they settle the minimum wage at, it should be tied into the annual inflationary increases instead of the situation where it stays that way for a long period of time, and then there's a big controversy about how much you can put the minimum wage up because of businesses being concerned that it would make it uneconomical for them and people would lose jobs. And then there's something called living wage. And living wage hasn't really taken off in this country yet, but there's 130 cities in the United States that have a living wage program. All the big cities, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston, they all have what they call a living wage program. And perhaps one of the best is in London, England, where they not only have one for their municipality, but they also encourage their private sector to get on board with a living wage. Now, what is that? A living wage is more than a minimum wage, because a minimum wage for a lot of people isn't going to bring them up above the poverty line, particularly if they've got a family. But a living wage is about 50% perhaps more, sometimes 60% more than what a minimum wage is. And it's something that's done at the municipal level. The municipality would say, well, we're only going to give contracts to companies that pay a living wage, and here's what we think the living wage is. My city, Toronto, has had something called a fair wage for about 100 years. It had a different motivation. It came about as a result of trying to ensure that if we weren't giving a contract to a union shop, that at least they were paying a fair wage. But it's another form of this kind of living wage. So living wage is something that can be done at a local level, and if you can get other parts of the community, businesses or other public institutions to become a part of that, it can have an impact, a very positive impact as well. An interesting part of the living wage is a measure taken by Henry Ford. Henry Ford was no big fan of unions back when he was producing his cars in the early days, but he did believe that he should pay a livable wage to his employees, simply because he wanted them to buy his cars. But it's something that worked for him, and it's something that I think living wage is something we need to look at more. Well, then there's basic income. Basic income is actually here at the bottom. Basic income or guaranteed annual income, or as you're calling it, a guaranteed livable income. Basic income is becoming the more common phrase, so I'm going to use that. This is the definition as given by the Basic Income Canada network, and they're in effect saying that no Canadian should live below the poverty line. The method of putting such a basic income into effect, or one method, is this, the negative income tax. If you're not earning money, or if you earn so small amount of money that you're not paying taxes, you would get money back from the government to keep you above the poverty line. Now, we do have some experience in basic income programs. The seniors have the guaranteed income supplement, which together with the OAS, the Old Age Security Plan, and the Canada Pension Plan, when all of them are combined, this program is a form of basic income. It is a form of guaranteed income. It's brought the seniors in poverty rate down from 30% as it was back in 1977 down to 5% as it is today. So there's been a very drastic reduction as a result of this program. We still need to do a little bit more work here. There are still some seniors in poverty, particularly some single women in poverty that more attention needs to be paid to. But that is an example of a basic income program. The GST rebate for those of low income is also, for a lot of us, it's something you might get, if you get it at all, you might get annually, but for those of low income, they can also get I think it is a quarterly payment. The National Child Benefit, again, helping to get children out of poverty, but children are in poverty because their parents are in poverty. So this benefit, however, assists in that way, and so does the working income tax benefit, although the working income tax benefit doesn't reach nearly enough people, and it is still very modest. There are people that have a couple of jobs, 2 or 3 jobs, and they're still below the poverty line, and even with this, they're not still able to make ends meet. So putting actually more money into the hands of low-income people will help move the economy along better, because people that are low income need to spend that money to provide for the necessities of life. So it's a good way of helping them and helping to move the economy along as well. Now, the one experience we have on a basic income plan was what is called the MINCOM experiment, and it was done in the 1970s. It was done between 1974 and 1979 in Manitoba. They took a number of people and put them on the program, but they most particularly focused on one community, on one city, and that's the city of Dauphin. That's what they call a saturation site, because the entire city, about 10,000 people, were eligible for the program. Not all those people needed the program, obviously, but that entire city or town was eligible. Now, they produced a lot of data, but unfortunately they ran out of money before they analyzed a lot of the data. They had some 1,800 boxes of data that they had produced, and the program ran out in 1979. The government of Manitoba changed. The original government, I can't remember which political stripe it was, but they made this arrangement with the government of Canada, which was then headed by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and that set the program up. But then in 1979, Trudeau gave way to the Clark government, a conservative government, and the Manitoba government also changed, and they just dropped it. So not enough analysis was done at the time. But there is a professor at the University of Manitoba, Evelyn Forget, who has since done a fair bit of work, and she has found some interesting things. For example, hospital visits dropping. And they did this with a comparative group in another community. They picked comparisons so they could see those who were on the system versus those who weren't on the system. And they found that hospital visits dropped some 8.5%. There are fewer emergency room visits. As you can see, a number of things that were less of, including mental health issues. The stresses and strains of being in poverty were also impacted by this. And one of the concerns that a lot of people have about basic income programs is, will people still be attached to the workforce? I firmly believe that people don't want to just live on the poverty line, don't want to just barely get by. They want to be able to make a decent living. And I think this particular experiment showed that they still did. The only people that dropped out, really, in any numbers, were new mothers who wanted to stay at home and look after their children, or teenagers who had gone to work, dropped out of school and gone to work. Well, this gave them the chance to get back to school and to graduate, and graduation numbers went up. So that meant that they had better opportunities for job prospects in the future. So I think so far what Dr. Forget has been able to find is that it had a lot of good aspects to it. She's written a publication on this called The Town with No Poverty, and you can get that by that name or under her name, Evelyn Forget, if you want to further look at what she found in this regard. There were also some other experiments that were done in the United States, and they had similar kinds of results, although in a couple of American cities, somebody got the stats wrong, and they said, well, there's a growing divorce rate as a result of this. People seem to want to get out of marriages now that they've got this basic income. It proved to be a false piece of data at the end of the day. So, and another interesting thing about basic, different countries have different ways of doing these things. The Scandinavian countries, for example, Brazil, another example, they brought in a thing called the Bolsa Familia in 2003. 46 million people were eligible for it in their country, and it dropped their inequality by some 20%, improved the education, improved the health outcomes in the country. So those are some other examples of experiments or programs that are working in terms of basic income. So let's get back to the numbers here. 30 billion versus 12 billion. Now, while there be transitional costs, overall we don't need to spend more money. We need to spend smarter, more efficiently, and more effectively. We'd be saving a lot of that 30 billion. I wouldn't say we'd save all of it, but we'd be saving quite a lot of it. And on top of all this, the administrative savings, the bureaucracy that delivers the social welfare system in our provinces right across this country, pretty expensive. The rule books are humongous. In Ontario, over 800 pages of rules in terms of social assistance, and huge bureaucracies. So, basic income would save an awful lot of that money. So, I think it shows the case, it proves the case that we can't afford poverty anymore. It really would be cheaper to go the route of getting people out of poverty. So, where do we go from here to try to do that? Well, a recent Environics poll showed that 52% of Canadians are in favor of a basic income, 42% were opposed, but I think it's a growing issue, a growing concern for a lot of people, a growing support level. The thing we need to do, though, is get this across to the people in political office to help create the political will. Malcolm Gladwell says if 10% of the population gets moving in the same direction on an issue, then change will come about. So we need to start here. We need to start to build 10% to help create that political will, to help tell our elected representatives at different levels that they've got to do something about poverty and about income inequality. Now, another way of doing this is to do a pilot project. The Dauphin experience, the Manitoba experience, is quite a number of years ago, and as I said, it wasn't fully analyzed, and it was dropped prematurely. So let's look at another pilot project possibility. Now, the people in the Basic Income Network have suggested, here's one possibility, and that is to create a project for 1,000 participants. And they estimate that it would require about, on average, $6,000, they're basing this on income tax returns, about $6,000 per person of those 1,000, in other words, $6 million, to bring them up to the poverty line, and just over the poverty line. So, here is a possibility. Here's a way of further developing the interest and the proof that basic income, in fact, can work well. So, this is where I'd like to see us head. Nelson Mandela said that overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity, it is an act of justice. It is the protection of a fundamental human right, the right to dignity and a decent life. Let's work towards a shared prosperity. Thanks very much.